But we're jumping back into Mark's gospel this morning, and we're right in the middle of five stories, rather, that uh, end in this plot to destroy Jesus. And so last week, Dawson walked us through the first two stories and showed us how Jesus heals this paralytic man who's let down through the roof, and doesn't just heal him, but also forgives him. And he's accused of blasphemy, because who can forgive sins but God alone? Of course, that's the point. Jesus is God. He is the Son of God. And so then there's this story of Jesus partying. He's feasting with these unsavory characters. And so Jesus is accused of eating with sinners. And again, that's the point. Jesus says, these are the people that I came to rescue, those who know that they're sinners. And so as the religious leaders are observing Jesus, and they're discovering that Jesus does not fit into any of their categories, he's shattering all their categories. And so either Jesus, as you read the Gospels, you come to the conclusion, either Jesus is a lunatic, or he's a demon, or he's actually the Son of God worth following. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, says a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He did not leave that open to us. He did not intend to. And so if forgiving and eating weren't enough, Jesus is about to make two more radical statements about who he is as a person. And he's going to make these two statements through these three stories that Andrew just read. And what we're going to see is that Jesus radically recenters two things. He radically recenters our worship and, in reality, our whole lives on him. And he radically recenters the law on love. In chapter 2 and verse 18, and I'd love for you to have your Bibles open, just so you can look down and know that I didn't pull this out of a hat. It's actually in the Word of God. But in chapter 2 and verse 18, the people come to him with this question about fasting. And so if it doesn't make sense that they're asking about fasting, just remember that in Jesus' day, fasting was a huge deal, especially with the Pharisees. And just to remind you, the Pharisees were the largest religious party of the day. They were formed about 170 years before Jesus came, and they're originally known for their deep devotion to God. They were known for how much they studied the Bible. They ate Bible trivia for breakfast. They knew the Bible better than anyone else. But by the time Jesus came, they were so obsessed with the exact observance of the law that they built these fences around the law. And they thought all of these extra rules that they created would help protect people from disobeying the law. And those rules became so important that to break those rules was equivalent to breaking the law. And so Jesus, over and over again in the Gospels, we find him showing how crushing those burdens were, and how the Pharisees had turned traditions and the commandments of men into the commandments of God. And so here this question of fasting comes, and in the Old Testament, there's only one time that a fast was commanded, and it was the Day of Atonement, once per year. But the Pharisees had created all these other days for fasting, and then they voluntarily fasted 2 days a week on Monday and Thursday. And so although they didn't go as far as requiring fasting for everyone, the regular fasting of the day was an undeniable sign of religious commitment. And so some of the followers of John the Baptist evidently had also started this practice of fasting twice a week, and the Pharisees did. And so essentially the people come to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, you might want to stop partying so much. We saw that last week, right? Jesus was either going to a feast, at a feast, or coming from a feast. And so these people come to Jesus and say, we see you eating a lot, but we don't see you fasting. If you really want to be accepted as a religious leader of the day, You might want to fast. Like, what's going on here? Why aren't your disciples fasting? And the way Jesus responds is just so genius. He doesn't address their legalism. That's coming next, don't worry. But he gets right to the heart of what's behind this question. And he does that with this stunning analogy. He calls himself the bridegroom. He says when the bridegroom is present, the wedding party can't fast. And in the Old Testament, the only person described as the bridegroom was Yahweh himself. Not even the Messiah was described as the bridegroom. And so what Jesus is saying is God is here in the flesh. And when God in the flesh is here, it's not time to fast, it's time to party. And the weddings back then, they were not like our weddings today, right? Today, the bride and groom, after the ceremony, they take off for their honeymoon. Back in this day, for 7 days, when they got married, they would feast, they would celebrate, they have good food, good wine, song, and dance. And even the rabbis stopped teaching for a week so they could join the celebration. Now, to be sure, Jesus isn't opposed to fasting. We read even in this passage that when he's taken away, an allusion to his death, the disciples would fast. And later in the Gospels, we're going to find him commending fasting. But what Jesus is doing is he's getting to the heart of this issue, because fasting was meant to humble the heart over sin and increase hope and desire for the coming of the Messiah. And so the Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist, in their desire to fast, had missed the point of fasting. Maybe it would help to illustrate it this way. Every year with Emma, we do like an Advent calendar or an Advent tree or an Advent something. And every morning she wakes up and she looks at that and counts down the days. And so how absurd would it be if on Christmas Day, Emma gets up and says, I don't want to celebrate Christmas. I just want to keep counting down the Advent calendar. Well, that's how absurd this was. Jesus is like, the point of Advent is here. Christmas has come. I'm here present. And so it's time to celebrate. It's not time for Advent calendars anymore. It's time to actually celebrate the presence of God in our midst. And that gets to the very heart of the Pharisees' problem. They didn't believe Christmas had come. They didn't believe that the one standing in the midst of them was the Son of God. But to broaden this out for you and for me, what's Jesus' point here? Jesus' point is that the story is all about him. And so he radically recenters our worship, he recenters our lives, and he says, the story is about me. And so just as life stopped to reorient everybody around the celebration of a wedding, Jesus says something even more radical. Now that God is here in the flesh, all of history is reoriented around me. It orbits around me. The story's about me. We look at the Old Testament and we see, oh, this story's been about Jesus all along. We look at the present, we say, this is about Jesus. We look at the future and we say, this story is all about Jesus. Just a little, as I was studying this, I thought about our conversation on Tuesday night, since we're talking about spiritual practices and spiritual disciplines. And since Jesus is saying this in the context of fasting, I thought it's a good reminder, even as we talked about a little bit on Tuesday night, that disciplines are never an end in themselves, right? They're a means to get us to Jesus, the person. They're a means to get us to worship Jesus. And so if our spiritual practices or disciplines never get us there, then we've lost the point. We've missed the point of them. But Jesus is going even bigger than our spiritual practices. He's saying all of life is about him. With his presence, with his coming, we take our cues in the kingdom from Jesus as a person. All of life revolves around him. So to drive this point home even further, Jesus gives these two analogies. You don't sew an unshrunk patch on old garment, and you don't put new wine in old wineskins. Now, I don't know much about sewing, and I definitely know nothing about winemaking. But what we do know is that back in Jesus' day, there was no such thing as pre-shrunk cotton, right? They made their clothes out of wool or linen that shrunk like 30% when they were washed. And so if you took an old wool garment and you sewed a new wool patch on it and then you washed it, well, the patch would shrink, but the rest of the garment wouldn't. And so it would make a mess. And then the wineskins that they used back in the day were kind of like this, just this animal skin that was used to ferment the wine. So if you use that wineskin, you put wine in it, the fermentation process would expand the wineskin. So if you use that wineskin again, filled it up to the top with new wine, then when the wine fermented, it would break the wineskin and the wine would spill and spoil both of them. So whether you know anything about sowing or wine, the point is that Jesus is making is you can't sew Jesus on as a patch to your life. Jesus isn't an add-on. The Pharisees and the crowds, they were trying to figure out, how do we categorize Jesus? Like, how do we fit him into our lives, our religious practices? And Jesus is saying, you can't fit me in. To use the party illustration, Jesus is saying, I'm not going to be a guest at your party. I want you to be a guest at my party. I want you to leave your party and be a guest at mine, because my party is so much better than yours. And so that's the question, I think, for us today. When you look at your lives, does it look like the story is all about Jesus? Does it look like the story is all about Jesus? I was sharing my story this past week, and I'm just reflecting on the fact that even as a Christian, for so long, I was building my own kingdom and asking Jesus just to be a part of it. And Jesus very kindly has been dismantling my kingdom for years and showing me that his story is better, that he's the hero of the story, and that he's supposed to be the king, and I'm just part of the kingdom. We see the bumper stickers, Jesus is my pilot, or Jesus is my co-pilot. Well, they're both wrong. Jesus is the pilot, the co-pilot, and the whole plane. We're just passengers. The story is all about Jesus. And so I just want to invite you into that question. As you look at your marriage, as you look at your singleness, as you look at your parenting, your job, your past week, ask the question, does it look like my story is all about Jesus? Does it look like Jesus is the hero, the center of the story? Or does it look more like he's a patch, he's an add-on? I'm plugging him into the story that I've written. I know it's a huge question, but Jesus actually isn't done yet. He's not done recentering us. I told Dawson, this is 2 sermons. And he's like, I know, I had to preach 2 sermons last week too. You can do it. So here we go. Sermon number 2. Jesus not only recenters our worship and our lives on him, but he recenters in these next 2 stories, he recenters the law on love. The law is all about love. In verse 23 of chapter 2, that Jesus and his disciples, they're walking through the grain fields, and they're picking grain and eating. Now, that was okay to do that on any day of the week except for the Sabbath day. They weren't stealing. It was actually allowed. If you're walking through somebody's field, you were allowed to take grain with your hands, just as long as you were using your hands, and actually use it to feed yourself. But the Pharisees are upset because they did it on the Sabbath day. Now, to understand why they're so upset, it's important to know that the Pharisees, they honored the Sabbath even more than the temple. Like, that's how much they honored the Sabbath day, because it was one of the huge things that distinguished the Jews from all the other nations. And remember what I said about those fences? Well, the Pharisees had some fences for the Sabbath day. Let me tell you, they had pages and pages and pages of rules for every conceivable issue on the Sabbath day. So they had rules like you can't tie knots on the Sabbath, you can't carry children, you can't help birthing animals, you can't sew more than 1 stitch, you can't write more than 1 letter. And one of the rules was you couldn't reap on the Sabbath day, even with your hands. And so Jesus response to their complaint, it's awesome. I love this. He says, have you never read? Now that's really funny, because they knew the Bible. They probably read it like 100 times, this story, but they had a habit of missing what was right in front of them. And Jesus says, haven't you read about David? He enters the tabernacle, he eats the bread of presence, which only the priests were allowed to eat, and he shares it with the people with him. And Jesus is saying, hey, David broke the rules because he was hungry. And his hunger and his life and the lives of those with him were more important than the rule. And then Jesus says it really clearly. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the whole point of the Sabbath was to provide a day of rest, to provide a day of recovery, to restore life. It was the one day in the week where shalom was supposed to be modeled, this wholeness, this life. And so for Jesus, satisfying hunger, which was part of reviving the body, was more important than all these Sabbath regulations. Now we're going to come back to this phrase that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath because it's huge. But Jesus ups the ante in the next story. He goes from the privacy of a grain field to the public scene of the synagogue. And there's a man with a withered hand when Jesus enters the synagogue, and there's this setup. The Pharisees are waiting to see, is he going to heal the man with the withered hand? And I don't know what this guy was feeling, but I imagine he kind of felt like, hey, I don't want to get in the middle of this dispute. I just got a hand that needs to get healed, right? But Jesus is always doing 1,000 things at once. And so Jesus tells the man to stand up and to come over to him. And you guessed it, the Pharisees had a rule about hands too. They had a rule about withered hands. On the Sabbath day, if someone's life was in danger, you could help them. You could help rescue them. But if it was for anything else, including a withered hand, you had to wait till the next day. But Jesus stands up and says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do harm, to save life or to kill? And they're silent. They're silent. And that silence spoke volumes. And we get this rare insight into the emotional life of Jesus. He's angry and he's grieved that their hearts are so hard. They were so consumed with the rules that they had created that they missed the point of the Sabbath. And not only that, they missed the person standing right in front of them. Here's this man whose hand needs to be restored. His hand needs life, and they don't have an ounce of compassion for him. All they could see was a lawbreaker. And what Jesus spoke in the grain field and what he shows in this miracle is that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And that was so huge for these Pharisees to hear. That's why they were so angry. They had become the guardians of the law. They were the interpreters of the law. And Jesus says, actually, you got it wrong. Like, that's my job. I'm the one that has the authority to restore the law to its original purpose, which is to show the love of God. And as they realize their power and control is being threatened by Jesus, they team up with the Herodians to put Jesus to death. And we don't know much about the Herodians, except they probably were not as religious as the Pharisees. And so Jesus had a knack of offending both the irreligious and the religious. The gospel does that. And they were willing to team up with the Herodians because they were losing control. And just a little side note, often legalism is more about keeping control than it is about obedience to God. I was thinking about this week, and it's so relevant even in our day, because you see in the church, this especially, you see this in the area of sexual abuse. Often churches that are the most strict about the issue of sex and talk about purity the most and have the most legalism around that subject are often the places where abuse is covered up and abuse exists the most. And often legalism is the very means of keeping control and protecting an image. And so here the Pharisees, because they're losing control, are willing to break the law themselves and to plot to kill Jesus under false pretense. But why is this so important to us? Let's be careful as we talk about legalism that we don't just talk about people out there, right? Let's be careful that we don't become legalist about legalism. Because it's in every single one of us. It is the sin that never dies. It is the sin that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and it's still alive and well. And even in the most gospel saturated heart, legalism is just around the corner. And so often we define legalism as an attempt to keep God's law in order to gain God's favor. And that is a good definition. That's really and in many ways, what's at the heart of it. But there's a root of legalism that Jesus is getting at that I think is really important for us to see. And at the root of legalism is separating the law of God from the person of God. Separating the law of God from the person of God. Let me explain what I mean. The law of God, when God originally gave it, was given because he loved his people. It was a wise and generous father that gave the law of God. And the Bible, from start to finish, that's what you see, that this law that God gives is not God withholding something from us, but it is his kindness. And when we start to see the law of God as withholding something good from us, that is actually when legalism starts to take root. That was the temptation of Satan in the garden, right? Satan comes and say, yeah, I know God's given you all this stuff. Like, God's given you everything, but he's holding out on you. The one thing that he's holding back from you, this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he's holding back the best from you, because if you eat this, you're going to be like gods. And so they're convinced that the command was actually God withholding something from them that was good for them. Sinclair Ferguson, in his book The Whole Christ, really has been helpful to me. So let me just read this to you. It's a little bit long, but track with it, and then I'll give an illustration that hopefully will help. Legalism, he says, is simply separating the law of God from the person of God. Eve sees God's law, but she has lost sight of the true God himself. Thus, separating his law from his loving and generous person, she was deceived into hearing law only as negative deprivation and not as the wisdom of the Heavenly Father. Thus, the essence of legalism, Thus, the essence of legalism is rooted in a distorted view of God as the giver of his law. God becomes a magnified policeman who gives his law only because he wants to deprive us, and in particular, to destroy our joy. Did you hear what he was saying there? Legalism starts when we view God as a magnified policeman instead of a loving father. So let me give you this illustration that might help. Pretend you're driving and you look in your rearview mirror and you see a police car. And instinctively, at least most of us, we slow down even if we're going the speed limit, right? We see the police car and we're like, oh, what, am I doing the right thing? And we slow down. We turn on our blinker like 8 blocks before we make a turn, right? We instinctively become legalists. We go beyond the rules because we're afraid of getting pulled over and getting a ticket. If we drive on a street and there's no speed limit sign, we kind of freak out. Like, well, what's the speed limit? Like, what's the rule here? But imagine instead that the head of the city council, or whoever it is that makes laws, I guess it's a team of people, right? But let's just pretend it's one person and all the laws, the speed limits and everything are good laws. And he's your father. Like, that's the key point. He's your father, and he's sitting in the car next to you. And as you're driving, he's explaining to you the heart behind the laws. You're going through a school zone, and you're like, he's like, it's 15 miles an hour, not because I want to annoy you when you're trying to get to an appointment fast. It's 15 miles an hour because, see these children over here, want to love them, as your neighbor and protect them. You're going over a bridge and the speed limit drops, and the father's like, because of the wind gusts on this bridge, it could harm your family. It could harm the families of the people around you. That's why the speed limit's different. Like, he says, I don't want you on your phone, not because I'm trying to take away your freedom, but because it's loving your neighbor, not to be distracted. And so pretty soon, driving becomes an experience of fellowship with the Father. And pretty soon, you almost forget about the laws. And if you run across a street where there's no sign, you're just asking the Father a question, like, what would be the best thing here? Like, what would be the most loving thing to do in this situation? And then the reason that you keep the laws becomes different. Instead of this fear, it's that you want to delight in the Father's heart of love, and you want to reflect that. And pretty soon you don't even need the rules almost. It just becomes this time of fellowship and communion with the Father. And of course, that's the essence of the law, right? Jesus said the essence of the law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is why the gospel is such good news. Even though God gives his law out of love, our sinful hearts condemn us because we can't keep the law. And so God sends his son Jesus to keep the law for us, to take away all of our condemnation. And not only that, he gives us a new heart to actually love God's commands, to actually see and delight in the lawgiver himself. You see, grace doesn't say God doesn't care if I keep the rules anymore. Grace takes away condemnation and then helps us reconnect the loving heart of God with his commands. Now, if this raises questions about how do law and grace connect together with the gospel, well, maybe someday we'll preach through the book of Romans. But in the meantime, if you got questions, I'd love for you to email me. If they're really hard questions, email Dawson. Just kidding. But I would love to answer any of your questions about that as we work through this. But here's what I want to leave you with here this morning. These two questions as we go into communion. Number one, the one I mentioned, when you look at your life, does it look like the story is all about Jesus? And then number two, when you hear God's commands, do you hear the Father's heart of love behind them?